And welcome to the first evidence session of the Environmental Audit Committee in this Parliament. I'm honoured to have been elected Chair of the Committee for the current Parliament. Look forward to building on the excellent work of the predecessor committee chaired by Philip Dunn. I'm delighted to be starting our work today with an introduction to the Government's proposed planning reforms and their effect on the environment. The unique feature of this committee is its remit to examine the government's policy on the environment across all departments. This cross-cutting work is hugely valuable and enables us to get an overall view on how the commitments of ministers on the environment, climate and sustainable development are being implemented. When discussing our future programme, colleagues were in no doubt that the environmental implications of the government's proposals to boost housing growth in England ought to be examined. No one doubts that the country is in a housing crisis and that new homes are desperately needed, but we're also facing an environmental crisis and a climate crisis. So as our first inquiry, we've decided to examine how the government is going about changes to the planning system to promote housing growth and what effect these changes may have on the environmental protections in the planning regime. This evidence session has been arranged as a scene-setting discussion for us to gauge what the issues are. The terms of reference for our inquiry were published on our website on Monday, and I encourage all who are interested to study them and to give us their views. I'm very grateful to our first panel of witnesses for agreeing to join us today. Can I ask each of you to introduce yourself for the record, starting from my left, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Alister Scott. I'm a Professor of Environmental Geography and Planning at Northumbria University. I'm also a chartered member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, but the views given today are personal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophie O'Connell, Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance. Green Alliance is a charity and think tank working for ambitious leadership on the environment.
Hi, my name is Anthony Breach. I'm Associate Director at Centre for Cities, where I'm the lead on housing and planning. We look at the role that cities play in the national economy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for introducing yourself. Now, government are proposing very significant increases. What needs to change for the government to achieve those increases, and can they be done in a way that doesn't weaken environmental protection? If I start with you, Professor Scott, please.
Well, yes, and there are a large number of increases, and I think the starting point of the MPPF consultation was one point that housing is the starting position. I disagree with that as a starting point, because to me the starting position has to be about placemaking rather than focusing just on housing, because that's the priority. And I think from my perspective it's really important, building on the Dasgupta review, which was HM Treasury appointed in 2021, where the recommendation was to think, act and measure differently. And actually, I don't see in any of the MPPF 23 or 24, the consultation, any changes in the way that we think about prosperity and economic growth. So to me, I'd like to see a much more balanced, breaking the policy silos approach to the way that we actually plan. And at the moment, whilst I welcome the strategic planning rebirth in the National Planning Policy Framework after it was pickled in 2010, I think the danger is that it's focusing purely on housing, environment and community in separate silos, rather than what I see as strategic planning, good planning, joining them up together. And my own research has shown, published this year, that a lot of the new policy areas, the policies for nature, are fundamentally siloed and weak. So the policy wording of the National Planning Policy Framework, compared with Wales and Scotland, is a lot weaker, and there's major areas of nature missing, such as blue infrastructure and stewardship. So I think the issue is, at the moment, that there's a loss of damage to the natural environment through weak policy wording, and we need to improve that policy wording if we're actually going to deliver the kind of environment we want, the kind of homes we want, the kind of places we want.
Thank you. Sophie?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Alister has said in terms of placemaking. In terms of that, we've been doing some work with other environmental NGOs, thinking about, in terms of the government's housing agenda, the appropriate locations and particularly public transport and active travel infrastructure, rather than placing new towns in areas of greenbelt and places where there's poor transport connectivity. We know that economic growth is very closely linked to public transport connectivity, as it connects people to economic opportunities and social and leisure activities, and that's really important to a healthy society. And so we think that new housing development should be strategically placed around places where there is strong public transport and active travel infrastructure, or where that can be brought in quite rapidly. At the same time, we think we need to have more of an emphasis on densifying housing in the UK. There's a lot of demand for dense properties and townhouses in cities like Edinburgh, Glasgow, London. They're really popular and sought after, and yet we don't really build like that anymore. That's something that could definitely be picked up. And just going back to the transport point, something that we're developing with other environmental NGOs is thinking about a no net traffic growth test for new housing developments. We haven't quite figured out exactly how the wording of that would work, but it's something that we think the government should really look into to make sure that we're not creating communities that are car dependent for decades into the future. Even with the electric vehicle transition, we know that that won't be enough to get us to our climate targets. And then, there's a lot of kind of nature points that Alister picked up on that we can pick up on throughout the session.
Thank you very much. Anthony.
So our analysis at Centre for Cities shows that since the planning system was created in 1947, we've established a shortfall compared to the average Western European country of about 4.3 million missing houses, which is about 15% of the housing stock in the UK. And if we're serious about tackling the housing crisis, and I'm sure kind of members of the committee will see kind of examples of this in their own surgeries, those houses simply have to be built. Like, there's just simply not enough stock, there's not enough floor space for people to reside in. I think the question from an environmental perspective is really, where are those houses built, and how does the planning system ensure that those houses are in places that are both environmentally sustainable but also economically make the biggest benefits to both local economies and to the national economy. Sort of part of the problem with the planning system is that even though we know that cities are broadly good for the environment and nature, that sharing land, sharing infrastructure reduces the pressure that human civilization puts on the natural world, the way the planning system works, it's kind of case-by-case, discretionary nature, puts houses in the places where they are least politically unacceptable, which often means, far away from existing infrastructure, kind of more remote locations, more car-reliant locations, and not really in places where people want them either.
Thank you very much. And ministers are proposing increases to local plan housing targets based on existing housing stock levels rather than on historic growth. In many areas, planning authorities will see the requirement to allocate land to housing shooting up. Accepting what's been said about the sort of place-based approach, which there seems to be agreement on, how concerned are you about the impact that approach is going to have on our environmental protection? We'll start with you this time, Mr. Breach.
So I think one problem with the pre-existing system of targets we had, where it was based on kind of previous kind of population growth, was that worked fine for places that had fundamentally low demand for housing, so kind of parts of the north of England where kind of house prices are pretty low. But actually in places where housing delivery had fundamentally been low, but housing demand was high, so a lot of kind of greenbelt, shire locations, often with excellent public transport, also didn't have very high housing targets as a result. So I think on balance, the shift towards kind of a kind of the 0.8, the dwelling stock increase, is a net improvement for housing, for kind of housing outcomes. There may be some changes we'd make to it if that was kind of interest. I think from an environmental perspective, the challenge is more about, we know there are large areas in many of these places, and kind of in shire areas that have excellent public transport links into metropolitan areas, into city centres, that currently aren't being allocated for development. the planning system is still quite unclear about whether it really expects land, for example, in the vicinity of railway stations, to be allocated for new development, for new housing. I think that's kind of where the big gap is.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've not done too much work on targets, but I would say that building on the Greenbelt isn't kind of the silver bullet to the housing crisis that has been decades in the making. There are lots of other bigger structural system issues, and like the right to buy, selling off council housing, meaning we don't have council housing stock, increasing wealth inequality across the country. So we think there needs to be a real focus on affordable and social housing, and that should be a priority from the government. Labour did say that they would, the Labour government did say they would bring in, I think it was at least 40% affordable homes in new towns, but there's a question around the other 60% of that, and similarly, going back to the previous question, I think we need to look at which types of housing are needed in which areas, and look to organisations like Shelter, who have recommended at least 90,000 affordable and social housing to be built per year over this Parliament. And the kind of other infrastructure questions come in around making sure there's public transport infrastructure, but also GPs, schools, etc., to support this demand. Although we would recommend or would be against new road building for new housing development, and to place those housing around public transport and active travel infrastructure, as we know that new roads just create increased road traffic and bake in emissions for decades to come.
And finally, for me, Professor Scott, you hearing what you said about you would like to see a different approach taken in terms of place building, do you think that it is possible to bring about the kind of level of house building increase in a way that doesn't negatively impact on the environment if the government were to take an approach more aligned to that you outlined?
So first and fundamentally, as recommended by the Royal Town Planning Institute report, there needs to be extra resources for the local planning authorities themselves, because these extra numbers now are going to trigger extra work. And in my head, that's going to lead to really, the call for sites is going to be developer-led, and we're not going to have the right houses in the right places necessarily, because the developers are going to be shaping rather than, if you like, the planners. And in that sense, there needs to, it's not either or, it should be working in partnership and then working collectively to make sure that we have the housing, the environment, and as I said, all the infrastructure. I mean, to me, nature's part of the critical infrastructure with everything else. I think in order for it to happen, there just needs to be a more effective strategic planning process that brings those different players around the table from the outset. And we don't start with the housing numbers, we start with a broader base. And to my mind, we do need more planners in that particular equation in the public sector.
Do you quickly want to come in on that, Sophie?
Yeah, just to build on that, it's not just the planners, but completely agree in that RTPI report, I think, shows 25% of the profession left between 2013 and 2020. So there's been a mass kind of exodus of any expertise at local government level, and that was in the public sector. But it's not just the planners, it's the environmental expertise that we don't have, which means that when planning applications do come in, we won't be looking out for potential harm to nature.
Yeah, Olivia.
I just wanted to follow up really, because I think I'm very interested in how practically we can ensure that the framework works with the environmental measures that we already have. And you kind of touched a little bit on that, Professor Alister, but I was just wondering if there's anything else that you think we could enhance to make sure that all the different various provisions that we have in legislation actually are functioning, and how we de-silo. As you kind of said, silos was the problem.
Right. So first and foremost, we need a stronger enforcement and monitoring sort of sector in the local planning authorities itself, because I would see enforcement as the Cinderella of the planning system, and I'm afraid there's no Prince Charming out there that I can see. So in that sense, that's needed. I think also, and it may be something we come on to later, but the environmental principles that are under the Environment Act provide a mechanism, I think, for policy to better reflect those 5 principles, and I would actually add a 6th principle, the participation principle under the Aarhus Convention. But at the moment, there's a lack of clarity as to how those principles are being used. But I do see them as a way forward as well.
I'll bring Barry Gardner in, and then the opportunities for other people to respond to those points.
Professor Scott, first can I thank you for introducing the Descriptor Review into our conversation. NY over A must be less than or equal to G bracket S. So the whole model of inclusive wealth that Descriptor is talking about, I think you're right, must be the foundation for this. So it's really good to have you saying that to this committee, and I hope we can incorporate some of that into our recommendations. Look, I wanted to focus on the consultation that went out in July on the MPPF and the strengthening and reforming of the presumption, as they called it, in favour of sustainable development. They said that the primary role of the presumption is in addressing inadequate land supply. Now, you've argued that the current focus on planning reforms on economic growth and housing development distorts the concept of sustainable development and misrepresents its implementation within the planning system. You said that the presumption in favour of sustainable development should be redefined to explicitly incorporate the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Could you expand on those criticisms? Could you explain which specific environmental objectives are being excluded here, or which you think need to be specifically included, and how this committee might make recommendations which ensure that a more holistic or a complete range of environmental objectives is delivered, whilst not in any way undermining the government's 1.5 million target?
Well, thank you very much. And for clarity, that your comments there relate to my consultation response to the MPPF, which is obviously in the public domain. From my head, the first starting point is the viability issue. To me, in sustainable development, you need to have the environmental and social limits. And at the moment, we have a sort of an operational approach which has an economic slant on the viability. So for me, for sustainable development, we really would need to encompass much more of the environment and social limits. I think the other component of sustainable development that's definitely missing from the planning system, and I think it's a real weak link, is equity. And that's, going back to the basic definition of sustainable development, that talks about intergenerational equity. I'm talking about equity now is also a weak link in the planning system. We don't really deal very effectively with environment and social justice there. And so those are the two key areas in my head. But the third element is, I think everybody pictures sustainable development as this three-legged stool of social, economic and environmental. And in my head, we spend a lot of time around that stool, but it's not the legs that matter. It's the bit that we all sit on, our proverbial backside, if you like. And I suppose it's how we actually integrate that element. And at the moment, I just feel that because of the way viability is defined, because of the lack of equity and social justice going on, we've got this distortion that's occurring. So to my mind, that's where we need to address it.
Thank you. Mr. Connell, your organisation, Green Alliance, has rightly pointed out that the construction sector is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and that such an ambitious housing programme will have consequences for our emissions reduction targets. So I wanted to pose to you how best you think those might be mitigated, and in particular, perhaps you could outline for us the proposed amendment to building regulations known as Part Z or Part Z, and say how you think incorporating those into the government sustainability criteria might deliver for us.
Yeah, I can provide some additional notes after the session, but we're thinking about the materials when building. So steel and cement are some of the biggest sources of industrial emissions at the moment, and new homes obviously should be implemented whilst trying to minimise the climate and environmental impact of that. There are some lessons to be learnt from the London plan, which I could pass on in writing, which mandates carbon footprinting and circularity statements, particularly with circular economy being a priority for DEFRA. That's something that we think could be brought in, but I could provide some more detail in writing on how exactly to do that.
Okay, so to be clear, document Z, which I was referring to, that would set out requirements for the assessment of whole life carbon emissions, yes, and limit the embodied carbon emissions for all major building projects. Yep. And just to get your confirmation on the record, that would something that's aligned with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors professional statement. It's endorsed by RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and Chartered Institute of Building Services and Engineers. Yeah. Thank you. Finally, Mr. Breach, I know one of your research areas is the lessons we can learn from other cities around the world, and you've done a lot of research into that, I think, in Japan and other places in Russia as well. Valencia has been in our focus over the past few weeks after it received 343 millilitres of rain. That's 3/4 of its annual rainfall in just under 5 hours. Do you think that the proposed reforms are focused on growth at the expense of resilience and adaptation? And if you could perhaps talk us through the United Nations Sendai framework on risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, and say how this might be better incorporated into the NPPF reforms.
I haven't done any work on the United Nations framework that you can describe, that you've mentioned, but I think in terms of the broad question you've set out in terms of this trade-off between resilience and growth, I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction. We know there is there's efforts in the planning system to implement sustainable urban drainage schemes. It is obviously an ongoing...
I didn't mean to say that there was a contradiction here. What I was pressing you for was whether you felt that in the proposed reforms these things were taken into the same account as the other parts of the reforms, whether the mitigation element or the adaptation and resilience element was in some way losing out here.
Yes, of course. So I think my understanding of the NPPF changes is, well, my assessment is that they are relatively light in nature. They wind the clock back to about 2017, 2018 or so. I think the focus has really been about this question of house building and trying to restore it after changes that were introduced at the end of the last government that were designed to reduce house building. I think, kind of coming back to your question a little bit earlier about building that 1.5 million that the government has as a target, land supply has to be increased if the government is to meet that, because the previous government supplied a certain amount of land under the planning system and that did not reach 1.5 million. So I think in the context of resilience, I'm not sure that's been a huge focus in the context of this phase of planning reform, but I think if the government is serious about probably reaching that 1.5 million target and actually delivering other environmental benefits of house building, particularly getting more housing built inside urban areas, which the NPPF, as currently proposed, would really struggle, then I think there will need to be a bit more of a conversation around resilience and environmental benefits, as you describe.
Yes, Professor Scott.
Yeah, if I could just come in there, because yes, we've been focused on Valencia, but there's other parts of the world where there's extreme heat. New Delhi, for example, and all of the associated pollution and health disbenefits. I don't think in the NPPF, either now or previously, we're prepared for extreme weather going down that route. There are 15 mentions of flooding in the NPPF. There is one mention of overheating. And we don't have any infrastructure, I think, or any planning that's going on to look at that, such as grey water systems, use of building regulations for, we heard SUDs, but rain gardens, and actually tree species that are more drought resistant, because we will get extreme weather, and we've got large amounts of house building targeted in areas of water constraint. So that resilience is going to be a real problem unless we actually develop tools and policies to protect that.
Yes, and the mapping of excess deaths as a result of that, absolutely. Look, and the Sendai framework sets out 4 goals: the understanding disaster risk, strengthening governance to manage it, investing in disaster risk reduction and resilience, and enhancing our preparedness and response, and the whole principle of building back better. How much do you think, in terms of preparedness and response, the building regulations that we currently have, the EPC ratings, which we know are going to be changed, what should we be doing there to ensure that we're getting that readiness, getting that preparedness into the system, that resilience into the system?
So for me.
To anybody who wants to. Yeah. Yes, Sophie, Mr. Cromwell.
I was just going to say, I think one area in which I know there's kind of quite tension in policy as it stands is on overheating, in that you're seeing this conflict between Part O of building regulations, which pertain to overheating, which require kind of overheating standards to be applied to rooms which have closed doors. Other parts of the London plan, and their metrics on overheating relates to rooms with open doors and with cross-ventilation across dual aspect new dwellings that are being built. So I think even kind of areas in which government and the state have begun to think about these metrics on preparedness in response to climate change, the lining up between central government, local government, and then what that actually means for developers on the ground is often in a bit of a mess. There's scope for tidying in that area.
Mr. Cummins?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Can I bring in Ellie Chance now, please?
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to ask about the concerns around the MPPF reforms and its impact on the green belt. To what extent do you think that the proposed reforms achieve an effective balance between the demand for new housing and protection of the green belt? And what mechanisms could help achieve this balance? There's a proposal to really change the balance. What's your view on that, and what's your view on what's needed for adequate protection? Let's start this way and go along. Yeah.
I think broadly we support the changes that have been proposed in the MPPF. I think that, in the context of a balance between house building and protections of the green belt, the green belt in its current form is extremely large. It's about 13% of the land area of England, stretches from the Mersey almost to the Humber in the north. It is about 3 times the size of Greater London, the one around London, and it's remained largely unchanged since its designation in the 1950s through to the 1970s. And in the context where land supply has to increase, where house building has to increase, if we're serious about tackling these problems, then there does have to be at least some form of green belt release, or especially nearest to our urban areas and nearest to public infrastructure, because that's where people want to live and we get the greatest economic benefits. I think insofar as the proposals that the government has put forward in the NPPF with the grey belt definition, I think there's still a lack of clarity about what exactly the government means by grey belt. I think that there are fears that this could lead to a kind of a nibbling away of green belt in an unstructured and not particularly environmentally friendly way. I think to properly comment on that, I think we'd need to see kind of stronger clarity from government as to how they intend to define grey belt. But I would say the correct solution to kind of managing that balance, which you've mentioned, is to have proper strategic reviews of the purpose of green belt and where it is currently designated. So, for instance, we've done some research at Centre for Cities that's shown that you could build about 2 million suburban houses in railway stations feeding into the 5 big cities in England on less than 2% of the green belt. So we don't need to necessarily have massive designations of huge amounts of the green belt in order to achieve a big increase on housing outcomes and a big improvement, but we do need to be quite strategic and careful about making sure that the land that we're releasing is exactly what's being demanded by households.
I think this is an area that we're probably going to disagree on a little bit. We wouldn't necessarily recommend the release of the green belt. We think where it is released, that it should most definitely be prioritised for affordable and social housing, but We see it as eroding the kind of purpose of the green belt and not prioritising urban regeneration, which was one of the purposes of the green belt. Also going back to the point raised earlier on transport, we think that it will promote low density sprawl into areas that have poor transport connectivity, so would much rather kind of build in and around existing urban areas where possible. Also, we think that brownfield land should be prioritised over the green belt, even when that is more expensive or inconvenient to developers. That is where they should be developing over the green belt. Previously developed land and green belt should be kept for nature and to be used in that way for the environment and for access for the public to access the environment and have greater access to green and blue spaces, and we don't want to lose that privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Anthony Beach's point about lack of clarity. That issue of what's low value in relation to the grey infrastructure definition really concerns me. I think the other points I just want to build on, maybe I'm sitting in the middle here, but green belts are components of green infrastructure. They're vital components of green infrastructure surrounding those cities. And as such, they can provide very important sort of environmental services for carbon storage, flood mitigation, and access to people. Public access has been said for enjoyment. And to us, I'm building on some research work that a colleague of mine, Dr. Matthew Kirby, did actually at Northumbria. He's highlighted areas of high and low multifunctionality. So to me, if Greenbelt's going to be released, you want it released where it's performing less of those functions. And at the moment, the danger is it's not released in the best areas for that. So we want greenbelts to be multifunctional, like the remit of this committee, where nature, climate, health and well-being and all those different elements are joined up together. And in my current work, looking at the 8 Hills project in Bromsgrove, which is a regional park where they're looking at the south-west part of the West Midlands Greenbelt, that's a proposal there to integrate people, nature, health and well-being collectively within a greenbelt system. And obviously that will be funded by selected greenbelt release. But it needs to be in areas where there is less environmental damage and maximum multifunctionality, because that's the driving force for our policy in this country with land scarcity. We need multifunctional land use.
Thank you. A few follow-ups. Maybe I'll throw them out and you can pick up the ones that you want to pick up on. So on the point about the very vague definition of grey belts, I'm concerned about this idea of kind of limited contribution to green belts. Limited is an extremely flexible word. I mean, do you have a suggestion for how that definition could be drawn more tightly? I mean, perhaps if we said, demonstrably historically insignificant contribution or something like that, might that address some of the issues that we've got? Relating also to, second follow-up, the risk of deliberate degradation by developers of greenbelt land has been raised as an issue. To what extent do you think that is a potentially significant issue, i.e. developers purchasing land and deliberately allowing it to become worse and worse so that it would be permitted for development? And finally, and Sophie, perhaps this picks up on a point that you've raised in your previous answers, the sort of the point the government said about the kind of the golden rules that would have to be met before greenbelt land could be released for development. One of them relates to there's affordable housing and all the rest of it, but also release of land for necessary improvements to local or national infrastructure, including, blah, blah, transport links. Now, there's transport links and transport links, aren't there? There's public transport links. But this kind of seems to indicate that greenbelt land could be released for road building to facilitate low-density sprawl. Please pick any of those, or all of those three to follow up on. Thank you.
Shall I go first? So I think on the kind of grey belt question, I think in some ways we are a little bit nervous about kind of the concept of grey belt, as it kind of introduces a new purpose into into green belt, which isn't kind of explicitly defined, and you see this a little bit in other parts of the NPPF, where the green belt seems to play this role in kind of nature protection and nature preservation, which it hasn't historically had. It's been previously very specifically defined around urban containment and green belt land, which has that role of preventing the outward growth of urban areas, has been previously defined to be correct green belt use. If instead we start introducing much more nature designations, brackets, kind of designating some parts of the green belt as not contributing to a nature preservation role, and implicitly what we're actually doing is designating that 13% of England, which might not be the right land which we want to pursue nature or environmental preservation of, because of the role of cities and urban areas in reducing the pressure upon the natural environment. We know that the green belt causes house building to leapfrog the green belt, so we see new development being added on the outskirts of the green belt, and people having to drive everywhere simply to get about their daily lives without use of public transport and similar infrastructure. So I think for us, while there's probably scope to have either isolated parts of the green belt that don't make that contribution to urban containment, or for brownfield land which is in the green belt to be defined in a kind of grey belt way. For us, we think that a strategic review of the green belt is probably a safer option from an environmental perspective, but also probably more beneficial from an economic perspective as well.
Thanks. On the point of transport and green belt release, I think there needs to be a much stronger definition of what types of transport are sustainable transport, and therefore should be included in that definition. We definitely don't want to be releasing green belt for road projects which are really costly, bad return on investment for government, and bake in emissions, plus congestion, plus more siloed societies. We want public transport, and I think there could be some clarity there on the definition of what purposes it should be released for, rather than just broad transport. What is meant by that? What is meant by sustainable transport? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the addition of grey belt. I don't see it adds any added value, and it causes the potential for ambiguity and confusion. The point you made about the definition of limited is classic there. It reflects that problem, and also going back to the hard roots of it's supposed to be in exceptional circumstances. So the question for me is, when does exceptional become almost commonplace? Because exceptional to me is pretty rare, but we are almost talking about green belt release being pretty common now, and therefore that seems to be again corrupting one element of the NPPF with that. So I do feel the only other point I would make in relation to what Sophie was saying and the transport links, everybody does talk about the benefits of being close to stations, but we have a rail infrastructure capacity issue at the moment where you might well be near a railway station, but there isn't the capacity there, and we haven't got, again, this is where the strategic planning comes into play. We haven't got the joined up strategic planning for this. So we do need that good infrastructure planning, and we've got to be very mindful that these green areas are the lungs for many of people who live in cities, and as COVID illustrated, they're a bit more than just nice places to play. They're essential. They're the accessible spaces that, again, work by Matt Kirby found really important, and we neglect those at our peril.
Thank you very much. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to focus on biodiversity and habitat protections a little bit more, if that's okay. Firstly, do you think the proposed changes to the NPPF sufficiently consider biodiversity and habitat protection within them? Right to left, just to mix things up.
So my left. I can, coming back to kind of the NPPF changes being kind of relatively light in the grand scheme of things, winding the clock back to before the previous governments changed at the end of the last year. I haven't seen anything in the NPPF that really raised any alarms with me about habitats or biodiversity being particularly either under threat or enhanced by the changes that the government has brought in.
Just to talk a bit about biodiversity net gain. We've seen that brought in through the Environment Act at a 10% minimum, but actually in practice we're seeing it as more of a ceiling rather than a floor. There's some kind of unhelpful guidance around that would need clarifying, and we think that should be rapidly reviewed. There's also it needs to be brought in quickly for NSIPs, as that hasn't been introduced just yet. We're also seeing exemptions from biodiversity net gain actively being sought through certain projects. I can provide a bit more detail in writing on that, but kind of similar to what Anthony said, that the NPPF has sort of kind of tinkered around the edges. It hasn't created some big changes unless we're looking at potential development on the green belt and the impact that would have on certain sites.
So for me, the real big surprise in the NPPF consultation was that there are no changes in Chapter 15 on conserving the natural environment. And whilst biodiversity net gain has come in and that's made reference, we also have local nature recovery strategies, the natural capital approach that's being used by DEFRA, so a whole raft of policy mechanisms, but the NPPF has nothing to say on those. And I just found that strange, because in my head there's a real need to put strong wording around the duty around local nature recovery strategies. Otherwise they could become paper tigers. And given the point that I made previously, not just in this NPPF but the previous NPPFs and planning policy more generally for the environment, the weak policy wording except for the statutory protected sites has led to, if you like, trumping of the nature and the wider sort of nature network with economic interest, and therefore there's a real problem in my head about needing to improve the policy wording response. And in the work that we've done, we've seen a huge variability across the country in the policies that do exist in plans. But at the end of the day, the NPPF needs to have a much stronger hit. I think for biodiversity net gain, the key issues for me is that I think there's a risk that the mitigation hierarchy is being bypassed. So we're moving very quickly to, if you like, the compensation, the restore and offset, and the avoid and minimise aspects of the mitigation hierarchy are not really being hit. And again, that goes to the fact that it's not referenced. The other bit is, obviously, there's a small sites issue, but the biggest issue for me, the single biggest issue for me, is monitoring and enforcement. And whilst that isn't a BNG issue alone, it is an issue that really worries me. We're getting these very big schemes being developed with lots of ambitious gains, but who is monitoring and enforcing against those? At what stage are they never going to deliver? And how are we actually building that into the system? I think the resources needed for that have been underestimated. And the last point I'd say is that with the number of off-site units being developed, there's a real risk, this goes back to my environmental justice issue, that we will have development, and in those areas of development we will have very limited green infrastructure and biodiversity gain, because it's all going to be done off-site. I know at the moment DEFRA's favoured position is on-site, but there's a real risk that is going to happen, and that's something that I think really needs strong protection. But better policy wording from the top is vital for the nature conservation protections we need.
Just thinking of what you just said there, do you think there's a conflict at the moment between the concept of biodiversity net gain and actually the nature potential of any land, kind of thinking about grey belts? Do you think that's an issue? Or not? If it's not, it's great. But
well, biodiversity net gain, that a piece of land can have significant environmental value and deliver significant environmental benefits. First and foremost, biodiversity has to be key. But I think the wider environmental net gains are also very, very important to consider. So the danger, as I see it, and has also been recognised by the Royal Town Planning Institute, is that biodiversity net gains being considered in a silo, environment net gains is considered in a silo, and then the climate benefits are considered in another silo. So we're getting silos within the environmental field. And I think that to my mind is a big issue. And again, that can be reflected in the portals where the information is stored. And in that sense, we don't realise the multiple benefits that we can achieve. But if trade-offs are needed, biodiversity does need to take priority. I think there's been a lot of knocking of biodiversity net gain. I think the system, I'm a great fan of adaptive management and the cock-up theory. If things aren't working, you don't try and sweep it under the carpet. You learn from those lessons. And I just think, it is going to take a while. It is a world-first type issue. There are teething troubles. But we need to make sure that it's joined up and not done in its own silo.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think obviously biodiversity net gain is very new. We haven't at Centre for Cities done a kind of fully developed research programme looking into this area, partly as a result of that. However, what we're hearing from both developers and also local authorities is that it is turning out to be exceptionally expensive on the ground, and in particular for developments that would otherwise enhance the environmental benefits of cities. I mean, you're perhaps aware that biodiversity net gain is turning out to be easiest to achieve on large site allocations that the current planning system already does very well. New housing estates on the periphery of existing settlements or kind of deep into the countryside. Where it is really struggling is brownfield sites and small sites. And I think we're seeing estimates from Litchfields, which is an esteemed planning consultancy, where the cost of buying the units is 3 times the cost of the actual development. So the actual construction costs are X. The biodiversity net gain cost is 3 times all the bricks, all the labour, all the legal, all the marketing, etc. Because it is so expensive, kind of as a concept to deliver in urban areas. I think from a kind of conceptual point of view, I think that then suggests either limiting biodiversity net gain to those kind of site allocations in local plans. I think that could maybe be one possible alternative to the current system. I think also, though, kind of in principle, if biodiversity net gain is being introduced to kind of ameliorate or reverse kind of nature degradation that has already taken place in areas, the way biodiversity net gain is being structured is a tax on new development and a tax on essentially victims of the housing crisis. So young people are being asked to pay to fix the damage already caused by previous nature degradation. So I think what that kind of points to is, instead, if we're serious about kind of local nature recovery, local authorities having in-house ecologists, having kind of reforms of local taxation so that they have the resources and the kind of the mandate to do that, and working with new development, working with existing land, working with communities to improve and protect nature across their jurisdiction, rather than putting all of the pain on new development.
Can I invite Martin Rhodes to come in, and then Ms O'Connell, if you can maybe respond to that, and also Martin's question. But
thinking in terms about what we've just been questions around Greenbelt and also around biodiversity, how could the revised framework ensure that development on released Greenbelt contributes meaningfully in terms of environmentally and social objectives within the planning system? And which order you want to take that in?
I think maybe ask Ms O'Connell.
Yeah, first.
Yes.
Sorry, I might come to that second and just reply to Anthony's comment first on the biodiversity net gain point. I would say this is a new type of scheme that's being brought in, so like you said, there will be teething issues, but it isn't something to be scrapped, and I don't think we should throw around the word saying it's a tax on young people and people that are victims of the housing crisis. I myself am under 30. I'm not a homeowner because I can't afford it. Call me a victim of the housing crisis. But I would really love to have a thriving natural world for my future and for my potential children's future and my peers. And it isn't a nice to have. It's something that's really necessary for the survival of the human race and to countering climate change. So I think it's really important that we don't just scrap it at the first hurdle, and that we push through and, like Alister said, kind of find some workarounds if there are issues.
And then thank you for that. Can you also respond to Martin's question around The framework ensuring development on released greenbelt contributes meaningfully to the environment and social objectives.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier on, we're not necessarily in favour of releasing the greenbelt for additional housing, but where it is released, we would strongly propose that it be released for affordable and social housing, and to that be prioritised, and we'd like to see the kind of numbers on that. I think also there are other social and health impacts that could be brought in around, like I said, public transport access, but making sure that these communities are walkable and wheelable to amenities and economic opportunities, doctor surgeries, etc. That has a real strong social impact on society and would make us a healthier population, particularly as the government wants to focus on prevention of poor health and building an NHS fit for the future. We should look at prevention, and when people are moving house, that's a really good opportunity to interject and to change people's lifestyles and behaviours, particularly around transport use.
If I could, I mean, I may be not just fixing to the green belt per se, because here I would argue that green infrastructure is a useful delivery mechanism that can be used to deliver those wider environmental and social objectives, and that goes back to that principle of multifunctionality again. And I think it's really important that we think about, in a sense, green and blue infrastructure in that way, and we don't just fix just purely on the green belt, because that's one, yes, it's a significant area of land, but it's not where a lot of people live, and there's green spaces there. So to me, those environmental and social objectives are better met through an integrating mechanism, and it's really interesting in Wales they use the green infrastructure assessment as a bridge to unite the natural and the built environment together, and that cuts across multiple sections of the plan. I've forgotten the name of the actual planning framework in Wales, what it's called, Planning Policy Wales, yeah. And we don't have that in England. In England, we have it siloed. A lot of this, the green infrastructure and the environment is in Chapter 15 and nothing else. So if we could actually properly deliver that multifunctional green infrastructure, we can try and address those health and well-being issues. You know, the benefits to health from green infrastructure in terms of health prevention type issues. There's many studies showing its value. Natural England's green infrastructure framework helps support that, and Building with Nature, which is the first UK benchmark for measuring what quality green infrastructure looks like, deals with environmental and social objectives through its 12 standards. I should declare that I was chair of the Building with Nature standards group, so I might be sort of championing something that I worked with. But I think these are really important tools and mechanisms, as is the greening factor, to help build these much wider social and environmental objectives.
So I think you've heard a few of my kind of ideas on this kind of already, kind of strategic release of greenbelt, building on train stations, maybe even kind of keeping BNG and getting ecologists to work on greenbelt release. However, I'd say as a framework, kind of the overarching principle that should be guiding that is using greenbelt, which is as is designed to prevent urban growth, is going with the grain of urban economics and allowing kind of greenbelt release to ensure that new housing provides as much benefits to the environmental benefits of cities and urban areas.
Just to all of you, in terms of should we be looking at additional support for local authorities to create and maintain urban green spaces more generally? Not we've been concentrating on greenbelt, but just thinking about urban green spaces more generally. I don't know if you want to go first on this one, Ms. O'Connell.
Yeah, thanks. Just to echo what was said earlier about support for local authorities in terms of resources of planners and ecological expertise. That's really important. We won't know how to maintain and support pockets of green and blue infrastructure if we don't have that expertise. I think there can also be an improved system for data sharing amongst local authorities so that they can share best practice and learnings. I think we also need to think about the resilience of our green spaces to future climate shocks. We know that with current projections, we're on track for a 3-degree increase in warming by the end of the century, so planting native British trees probably won't withstand the heat and flooding that are consequences of that. But there are also lots of opportunities for bringing in more green spaces, looking at green roofs on houses. Also, Green Alliance did some work a couple of years ago looking at Birmingham City Council and their 10,000 redundant parking spaces that were free, that they didn't charge any revenue from, and replacing those with trees and looking at the maintenance costs of that. And it wouldn't have taken any revenue from the local council.
In principle, yes. However, I think when you look at local government as a system, we know there is this huge problem with obviously the huge statutory duties they're currently dealing with, and also conversely a problem where central government is imposing burdens on local authorities. Very individualised, tiny pots of money are going to local councils, and it's all being allocated and spent in a very inefficient way, and also not really respecting kind of principles of local self-government and prioritisation. I think we do know that voters really, really care about their local environment and local green spaces. I think if local government was reformed more broadly, we've done a programme of work around this that made it more fiscally autonomous and fix some of the structural problems it is currently facing. I think we could be quite confident that reformed local authorities would prioritise kind of urban green spaces as an area for improved amenity.
Very much. Can bring Barry Gardner in. He's got a specific question for Professor Scott.
Professor Scott, you spoke about the way in which currently the environment is siloed into Clause 15, in effect. This committee is in the business of preparing a report and making recommendations to government. What recommendations would you like to see in that report that could overcome that silo, that ghettoization of the environment? Because partly of what I think Mr. Breach has been arguing, the environment does underpin every sector, the economy, social, everything depends on the environment. But how are we going? What recommendations can we make that would actually help to achieve that in the MPPF?
Oh, thank you for that question. So at the moment, I see one big problem in that, if you like, MHCLG are seen to be responsible for the MPPF. DEFRA are then responsible for all the stuff that deals with nature. And that white paper and the Environment Improvement Plan, which maybe had a HM government, so every government department signed up to it, in theory does what you're talking about. But in practice, when you look at the MPPF, it doesn't incorporate those elements. So my starting point would be that we need somebody, and apologies if I go into a metaphor here, but we need somebody to conduct this built and natural environment orchestra. So if you can imagine an orchestra, we've got all these different sections blowing their own tunes and making rather discordant music. And I'm struggling to think who that conductor could be, but actually we do have one in theory, and that's the land use strategy that currently is sitting. But again, that's sitting in DEFRA's remit. To me, that land use strategy should be working right across all the different government departments. And it shouldn't be a top-down, and Lord Cameron, as chair of that committee, was very clear that this must not be a top-down imposition. So the conductor has to be a conductor of a jazz orchestra. So you've got the principles, but then everybody can play the music that then works collectively together. So I'm not sure that sits very well in a recommendation context.
I was just beginning to think that. Yeah.
But in reality, what it needs, it goes back to kind of the Dasgupta thing, is we don't need to think outside the box.
You're just pressing my soft spots.
Sorry, yeah. But we need to punch the edges of the box in order to get that kind of connection. So we need I always liken myself to an interdisciplinary champion. I don't sit comfortably in a geography, I sit in a geography department because it's a multidisciplinary area, but as an interdisciplinary person, I think we need more people that are willing to build bridges across them rather than perpetuate the silos. So it's a culture change from the top, and it needs to work down. If you want to see it in practice, there are places like the South Downs National Park where planners are embracing a lot of this thinking. And they come from London boroughs, they come in and the culture isn't down with one champion, it's permeated the whole team. And I've worked with the South Downs over several years and I've seen that culture work through the whole organisation. So it's a culture change that needs to happen. And I've seen it in Wales and parts of
Promised the chair a short question, but you've given me a very long answer. I'm sorry, Chair.
Apologies.
I didn't doubt it for a minute either. Julia Buckley, please.
So just coming back to some of the more pragmatic tools that we have at our disposal, I'd like to ask you each, please, how effective you think the current environmental impact assessment requirements are within the MPFF at identifying and mitigating potential environmental harms from proposed developments. I could start with yourself. Yeah, would you like to rest? Shall I start with Anthony?
I have a very short answer. I mean, it's not something that we've looked at in our research. I know there is growing concern among kind of parts of the sort of urban economics kind of planning reform community about some of the examples in which kind of environmental impact assessments have been used. For example, the high-speed back tunnel relating to high speed 2, but it's not an area we have developed thoughts on yet.
And yourself, Ms. O'Connor?
Yeah, we think that they have been effective in ensuring that site-specific impacts on certain species and habitats have been protected and identified. And there is also good integration with other policy tools like habitat regulation assessments. There has been some concern amongst environmental NGOs when the proposal to changing environmental impact assessments to environmental outcome reports was proposed, because that would give the government significant discretion as to the scope of those reports and whether they be undertaken or not. So we think that EIAs are kind of a stronger mechanism than that. And also, we wouldn't suggest further changes to the planning system because that just creates more delays. We want a consistent system so that planners and people throughout the system know how it works, particularly at a time when we're trying to speed up the process.
That's an interesting answer. Sorry, I'll just jump in there. I'm interested to hear that you feel that's stronger than the outcome reports. Are there any other improvements that you would want to suggest? You sound very positive about them, but this is your moment. If you did want to raise any suggestions to improve them in any other way.
There could definitely be improvement to data sharing amongst environmental impact assessments. That would therefore speed up processes for future applications.
In terms of making them publicly available earlier?
Yeah. And particularly with kind of neighbouring areas, I guess, or where there are similar kind of habitats and species to be concerned of. That's our key point on how to improve them. Thanks.
Very interesting.
I'll be short this time then. On EIA, I haven't got many comments and not much research to build on, but my main concern is quantity over quality, because at the moment a lot of the EIAs are just far too long and they're impenetrable to understand. The non-technical summaries, okay, but effectively I think they need to be streamlined. The area where I think there is a need for more focus is sustainability assessments, because at the moment obviously they will influence the development plans, and at the moment I think they're perceived as a hindrance and an obstacle, yet to me if they're used correctly they can be a very effective planning tool, and in my head that's where I would like to see the sustainability assessments bring in, and potentially some of the SDG material and the material on equity to improve those local plans, and then that filters down to the EIAs anyway. The only other point, I suppose, is they're still developer-led, and there's still that potential problem of the developers paying for the right result rather than for, again, the mitigation hierarchy kind of result. Thank you.
Interesting. And did you have a view about the environmental outcome report, whether that was
I
preferable?
agree with that point,
Okay.
the point that Sophie made strongly.
Thank you. We were going to come back to you about the presumption of sustainable development. I know you've spoken to it at great length, Professor Scott, but did either of you two have any views around whether that's currently fit for purpose in the NPFF around the presumption for sustainable development?
It's not something that I've worked on, sorry.
I think the changes that have been brought forward, I think, relating to kind of increased primacy of land supply within sustainable development are positive and something that we would support. I think a lot of the environmental damage that's been and nature damage that's been occurring across the country isn't really that particularly related to development that has occurred, and that if development was broadly more within urban areas, which would require even bigger planning reforms than the NPPF, but also kind of on the immediate outskirts of urban areas, allowing more people to access urban benefits, you could easily enhance nature nationally and locally while also making housing more affordable.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring Sarah Gibson in for a quick...
Just a quick curved ball before you all go is the reviews talked about new towns, and we did about 10-15 years ago talk about new villages, which of course quite often would be in the Greenbelt. Do you have any quick thoughts on whether you think the options for new towns or new villages, perhaps more appropriately, is something that you would consider viable within the reforms that we've had?
We have a report coming out on new towns in December, so keep an eye out for that. I guess our overarching reflection is new towns historically have only ever provided about 5% of kind of house building at their peak, so they're not going to make a massive difference. When they are built, they should primarily be built in the greater southeast, because that's where housing demand is highest. And to the extent that they're going to have these environmental benefits, they've got to have to be partly in the Greenbelt and linked into urban economies. I think there is a risk that they're sort of built where it's easiest to build new towns, which isn't necessarily the right economic or the right environmental location to put new towns.
Just quickly going back to the place-based point that was made at the start of the session, I think the location of those needs to be prioritised based on public transport and active travel infrastructure, or where that could be brought in most easily and quickly. Villages, it seems strange to be building much smaller developments rather than bigger ones in terms of transport connectivity and actually tackling the housing crisis, but also that affordable and social housing should be prioritised for those areas if we're actually to address the housing crisis.
Yes, and I just think it needs to fit into a broader strategic vision, so we can't just pluck these things out. They need to sit within an overall housing development strategy for that area that's built with the kind of consultation approach and partnership approach that I talked about from the outset.
Well, thank you so much to this, our opening panel of this parliamentary term. Really appreciate the excellent evidence that you've all provided. Thank you very much, and we'll bring this first session to a close and then invite the second panel in shortly afterwards. So thank you very much. Order. So we are now on to the second panel. If I could invite the three panellists, starting with Mr. Ellis, to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the questions.
Hello, I'm Dr. Hugh Ellis, and I'm Director of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association.
Afternoon, I'm Councillor Richard Wright. I'm the DCN spokesman on planning and growth and leader of North Kesteven District Council in sunny Lincolnshire.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Stafford.
Hello from West Yorkshire. My name is Sam Stafford. I'm a Charter Town Planner and I am the Planning Director at the Home Builders Federation.
Excellent. So the government are proposing significant increases. What needs to change for the UK to achieve those increases in house building, and can they be done in a way that doesn't weaken environmental protection? I'll start with you, Councillor Wright, if I may.
I think one of the first things to say, can it be done, when actually we need to look at the development industry itself and the skills and the personnel available, and it's clear to most of us from the evidence we get from developers that that's not the case. So whether they can actually build the numbers of permissions that are being suggested, then I doubt that very much. We've already seen a situation where we've got somewhere in the region of 1.1 million unbuilt out permissions. That there doesn't seem to be a rush to build out. I can give you a very distinct calculation on that. In my district, since 2016, we've permitted 11,500 and only just short of 5,500 have been built out. So that's either a control of the build-out rate, or it means that there isn't the skills there to build at speed. I can't see that that's going to change in the near future.
And you believe it's mainly because of skills that those permissions have not been built on?
I would say that at times we're told that. I think it's a mix of, is there the skills there? What would that do to the house prices if they were built at speed because the skills were there? So most of us in the planning system. I've been on planning committee for 17 years. I would suggest that actually it's more a control of rate of build out to maintain prices than it is to do with the skills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stafford.
Well, the HBF very much welcomes the changes to the standard method, and I think that fundamentally, if the country is going to build 300,000 homes a year, then it needs to plan for 300,000 homes a year. The current standard method adds up to 305,000, but when you take off the arbitrary cities uplifts, you get to about 230, and we're building 230. Now there are other factors at play, of course, macroeconomic conditions notwithstanding, but as a country we need to plan for 300. They need to be plan-led, so putting the standard method on a stock-based basis at 370 is a starting point for doing that. And then with the certainty and security of land coming forward, businesses can plan accordingly. I'd be more than happy to dive into the unbuilt planning permission and market absorption rate phenomenon in more detail, but I fancy that's a separate question.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of whether they can be achieved without sort of creating removing environmental protections, are you confident that that can be achieved with the planning framework as it's been suggested?
Well, I heard the previous session it was pointed out that there are no changes fundamentally to the definition of sustainable development in the MPPF. There's no proposed changes to chapter 15 of the MPPF, and the Environment Act, environmental impact assessments, habitat regulations assessments are embedded in law and unchallengeable. So. Yes, I think would be a legitimate answer to that question.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis.
I think the core issue is that the only way that you can meet this target is by a radical change to the way we develop. And that radical change has to include a new approach to environmental standards, particularly standards on health and well-being, because what we're building now is not fit for purpose. It's not fit for purpose in resilience terms, it's certainly not fit for purpose in terms of carbon. And it is interesting to me, speaking as a planner, which is not the most popular of professions at the moment, that the gravest mistake in public policy this nation has made over the last 40 years of planning reform is to fixate on consents and not to focus on delivery. The problem is delivery. And the private sector operates on the profit maximisation. That's lawfully what it's meant to do, and they cannot question that or be blamed for it. That is a reality. But we are consenting close on, just over 90,000 more consents for housing in this country, according to the government statistics, than get built every year for the last 10 years. And the issue has always been, if you consent land, the multiple problems necessary to deliver it require muscular government, local and national, to do that. The thing I'm really terrified about is that these housing targets as set, and I don't agree that they should be based on a percentage uplift of existing stock. That is a category error. You cannot separate housing forecasting from demographics. It's extraordinarily dangerous to do so because the planning system starts to diverge from actually what people need, particularly the complexity of an ageing population, for example, which is one of our biggest challenges. So there has to be wholesale change, and the point here is that the NPPF wasn't fit for purpose and hasn't been for 15 years. So minor changes to it now will not create the sort of the level of change in delivery that we need.
And do you are you concerned that the correct balance between the viability of developments, getting those completions, getting those permissions completed, and the ability of local authorities to represent their local communities, that balance will be correct with these targets and this planning framework or not?
I mean, as a very pro-housing organisation, we're caught with the problem that this is complex, but you cannot build in this country without consent. And the political cost of trying to do that has always failed in planning reform. The principal failure of all planning reform in the last 40 years has been to forget that people have a vote and that people care about their local environment. There is a tremendous amount of talk at the moment about command and control on housing delivery targets. I think it's not a respectful way to start a conversation with communities. My more positive view would be give communities the opportunity. They will meet their housing needs and take responsibility on the whole, and where they won't, government may in the end have to intervene. But at the moment there is no part of the NPPF that deals with cooperative housing, cooperative energy, community-led housing, nor any mention of the need to deal with the asymmetry in the planning system, where most communities, not all, but most communities have very little say, understanding or involvement in the decisions that shape their lives.
And Councillor Wright, as a council leader, do you share those concerns?
I do share them. I think that it's to different levels across the country. So, for instance, where my authorities, we're part of the Central Lincolnshire Local Plan, which went through not only local plan stage but revision last year. So that's three authorities working together, which gives us a little bit more freedom. As we know, the environment doesn't stop on a local authority line, neither does employment or any other factor. But simply imposing targets of this nature doesn't achieve anything. The number of iterations I've now seen of the MPPF and the MPPG, which get inflicted on us, and then occasionally we get asked to answer a few questions around the edges of a few parts of the policy where they're looking for an answer that fits government policy rather than what it fits for our residents. That's simply not good enough. We have to deal month by month with regards to the implications of the MPPF, trying to explain to residents what we can and can't do legally with regards, because local authority are not there to stop development. Most of them want to see sustainable, good development that benefit their communities, and not in the year that it's granted, but for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years it's going to at least exist for in some form. And so the current system is not fit for purpose. Inflicting an MPPF and then asking us questions at the last minute rather than asking us right from the outset, what would we see in an MPPF? That would be the better way of doing things.
And as local representatives, we all know that major housing applications come with considerable public concern locally. Government's clearly of the view that there's been too many of these blocked. Do you feel, as a council leader, that your ability to represent your constituents is undermined by this? And do you recognise that criticism from government and others that sometimes local authorities are so in hot to voters that they're actually preventing the growth that we need?
Well, we're just hit from all sides. So the residents are the ones that think that we're responsible when actually we're enacting policy. If you look at the stats, then I think it shows that 9 out of all 10 out of all 10 applications are actually passed. It's always the ones that are high profile that actually get the attention. So the thousands of applications that come in that are dealt with professionally and passed or rejected never make the headlines. It's always the ones that are contentious. It's where, unfortunately, we do have sections of our communities that will always appeal against something. They'll always launch a protest group as soon as we suggest change to anything. But if you can communicate with those people, you can work it through. But unfortunately, we're also living in a time of permissions by appeal. You know, the first time that you actually turn something down legitimately, you know the appeal has already been written, ready to be submitted. And
I mean, if we didn't have contentious applications, we wouldn't need planning committees, would we? But of course, that's right. Mr. Stafford, can I invite you to come in? You've heard a fairly gloomy view from our other two panellists. What's your view on the extent to which local authority planning departments are being supportive of the need for this development, and the extent to which they will be sort of unempowered by this?
I read this morning that only 20% of local authorities have adopted a plan in the last 5 years, which is a pretty telling and a pretty damning indictment of what is purported to be a plan-led system. And I think the government has struck upon the new government has struck upon the right diagnosis as to why local plan coverage is so poor and has been getting poorer over the past few years, and that is interminable questions around the number of homes authorities should plan to build, how unmet need is distributed from the larger cities that can't. The government have made moves in the MPPF consultation to try to deal with all three of those, and stated an explicit commitment to universal strategic planning coverage by the end of the Parliament. Which is a laudable commitment, and one that I think most people in the profession and the sector would hope that they succeed with. But the pressure that local authorities have been under, not just from a financial point of view, but with the removal, I think one of the previous contributors called it the pickling of the planning system with the revocation of the RSSs, without any national spatial expression of national priorities. And I believe I'm right in saying that England is unique amongst Western liberal democracies in not having a spatial plan. Out with any regional tier of planning to knit together land use priorities at a regional level, local authorities are then having to make decisions not just of local significance, but national and regional significance as well, whilst dealing with the implications of a localism agenda that told them that they were in control over absolutely everything. So, yes, I think that at root, I think, is the root of many of the ills and dysfunctions of the planning system, and hopefully we're in a better place in 5 years' time.
Yeah, and finally for me, Councillor Wright, what suggestions would you make for measures to promote the growth in housing construction whilst minimising the pressures on land supply?
The pressures on land supply. First of all, we've got the issue. We've got the issues with regards to before we're building any more new homes. Is land supply is regards to we're talking about the environment at this committee today as well. Is that we've got issues already in the built form that we've got, and what do we do with the land surrounding some of our built communities, especially with regards to flood mitigation and other issues that are affecting us, and that's got to be taken into consideration. I live in an area where I've got 80 different communities all surrounded by arable land or land of some kind, where that's causing part of the problem now with regards to the existing houses, and on top of that we've got to look at how do we free up some of that land in a sustainable way and in a way that isn't detrimental to both existing and new development, to allow that to be acceptable. the local plan process is a good way of doing that, and the figures you just quoted there, I'd like to just add to the figures in that 54% of all district councils have actually got a plan in place. And bearing in mind district councils are responsible for most of the planning decisions. A further 23% are working on one that was last enacted between 15 and 19. But of course, a lot of those local plans now, if they're in the process of being made, are now stuck at Regulation 18 stage. Because of the proposed increase in numbers, they can't go any further. So therefore, the plans that would provide some of this protection and free up land supply through the local plan process can't actually progress until we've sorted out the lifting numbers and what that does to their 5-year land supply. So
I mean, that's a very recent thing, you know, whereas this sort of lack of plans being in place is something that's been going on for years, isn't it, in fairness?
I think it's a different position across the country. So in some areas it's clearly laid out where that land is, but in other areas it's been in dispute for so long. Districts, and all local authorities are bound by their authority lines, so therefore you can have some very contained local authorities that simply don't have the land available. And so it's an issue it's got varying degrees of difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, it does weaken the argument that local authorities are being sort of undermined when they haven't got those local plans in place in the first place, doesn't it?
It only weakens it if there's a real reason for that. So there's various reasons why local plans aren't in place. Yeah. But of course, if people want to hang on to land and not bring it forward, how do you prove a 5-year land supply if you're not actually... Because you can only do this through a call for land. And if you put the call for land out and it's not responded to with people... There could be people that hang on to that land knowing full well that not bringing it forward leaves the local authority exposed on its 5-year land supply issue. That then allows them to... Basically, it's a builder's charter.
Eric Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'll just pick straight up on that. Land banking is clearly a problem. Cut the profit from the uplift that you get from agricultural to developed land, and you would actually undermine the way in which developers are gaming the system at the moment, wouldn't you?
You would, and it's something that we put forward through the MPPF responses. I've actually run a round table on the whole issue of house.
Is it a recommendation you wish this committee would make?
I would sincere. If the committee could look at hope value uplift, anything of that kind, then yes, that would be very useful.
Okay, thank you for that. Look, Mr. Ellis, your organisation, your association, was asked by the Committee on Climate Change to do a piece of research with the CSE, and you came back and said that most local plans are not fit for purpose when considering carbon emissions, and you said that many of the local plans that are in production are not even considering mitigation and adaptation measures. How do we remedy that?
The department 2 years ago said it was considering a comprehensive approach for assessing the carbon in local plans. We've recommended ways that can be achieved. It's actually not conceptually that complicated. The Committee on Climate Change agrees with that. There is nothing in the MPPF consultation that would implement that. Our conversations with the department have not been unfriendly about it, but it is absolutely critical, because unless you get a carbon literate local plan making decisions within the 6 carbon budget, there is simply no way this nation will deliver on the Prime Minister's very laudable recent announcement on reducing carbon emissions. And that is one of the great challenges. When you have to decouple growth from its environmental and carbon impacts. And that decoupling is technically perfectly possible. I was in Essex where authorities are doing it. The problem is that national policy thwarts the innovation of those local authorities trying to deliver, for example, passive house or equivalent standard. And government is still pushing forward with Future Home Standard 1 and 2, which have a marginal increase in carbon performance for housing and are based entirely on a proposition about grid decarbonisation that locks the people who live in those houses into fuel poverty, because it's not a fabric-first approach. The point up here, I suppose, is that there are multiple things and levers which government could do, and of course could have done in 2016 when zero carbon was lying on the table. And they haven't done that because of an idea that the industry is not capable of innovating to build to sufficient standard. I'm actually meeting loads of small and medium-sized developers who will build to that standard if they're given a fair regulatory playing field. and that's absolutely what we needed.
I think you were in the background in the committee when I was speaking with the witness from Green Alliance earlier, and we talked about documency and the whole business of assessment of whole life carbon emissions and embedded carbon in construction. Is that something, again, which you would like to see taken forward and put front and centre in the way in which we're approaching this?
Well, it has to be, because otherwise you can't solve that paradox, which is that growth, we need the growth and we need the homes. But unless you affect that decoupling, all that we're going to have is a busted carbon budget, which as a planet we cannot afford. And I would add to it by saying that the planning, that the MPPF is also critically unprepared for climate change in relation to heat, and you've heard that. Yep. It's also critically unprepared in relation to flood risk. Yes. And if you talk about 1.9 metres by 2080, the new surface water flood maps, and there is pressure all the time not to implement Schedule 3 and to make sure that surface water flooding is not subject to the sequential test in planning. All of those tests, the department has been under pressure to increase the stringency of and the accuracy of.
Thank you, and that was the point of my questions earlier about the Sendai framework and disaster risk reduction. So are those things that you would like to see this committee making recommendations on in its final report?
I think it's vital economically and environmentally, because the lenders are beginning not to lend. This insurance compact, only applies to homes built after 2009, and 25% of all the flood resilience projects in this country got cancelled last year. 80,000 homes will know that would have been protected by flood defence projects now won't be, and the list of those communities affected is dramatic. You cannot magic a world in which 1.5 million homes are built until you've solved the infrastructure problems vital for their future resilience. There is no magic way of doing that. So and this is a sequencing issue. Yes, we need the homes, but don't invent an undeliverable target until you have the mechanisms necessary and the standards necessary to deliver them in a sustainable way.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wright, I'd like to come back to you and perhaps also to Mr. Stafford in talking about the resources that local authorities have, particularly if you look at what the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Managers have said about the availability of ecologists in the planning departments. I think their latest report said that only 1 in 3 planning departments actually have a full-time ecologist, qualified ecologist, as part of their team. What are those resource constraints, those skills constraints, and what does government need? What should we be recommending to make sure that we can meet that need that's going to only grow with 1.5 million more homes?
It's about having those trained people available in a world where competition is great and people will go to wherever the money is, basically. So across central Lincolnshire, which covers roughly 900 square miles, we've got 1 ecologist. And that's we're pretty lucky that we've got that, because you say some local authorities are struggling to get any at all. So quite often it's about buying in that advice on a consultancy level. But we employ one. We'd like to employ far more than that, because the amount of work that's coming downstream, especially with regards to not just on the permissions but on the BNG side, then the amount of work that's being generated is phenomenal.
And do you think that, and perhaps to Mr. Stafford, do you think that local authorities have the regulatory, the legal powers that they need to ensure compliance?
I think that if the MPPF reforms, and if the government is going to get anywhere near building 1.5 million homes within the Parliament, there will need to be an significant uptick in planning applications next year, and they will need to be determined in short order. And the trend has been for applications to take longer, and that is a consequence of local authority resourcing. But it's also a consequence of the increasing role of the statutory consultee in the planning process, as planning has been grappling with more and more technical considerations, of which carbon and the drive for net zero is a more recent one. But but flooding and ecology and the role of the statutory consultees in infrastructure provision and so on has become more important.
Let me put this back to Councillor Wright, because what I was pushing for was more something about the regulatory powers that local authorities have, and whether in fact you feel that there are further powers that you require in order to be able to enforce the environmental protections properly when the NPPF comes in.
I think the problem starts with the NPPF. I mean, what are we going to enforce? It's a missed opportunity. It doesn't cover an awful lot of what we probably look for, but it's not so much the gift of powers, it's what that will actually do to us as local authorities. So, for instance, if you want the power over enforcement of BNG accredited land, for instance, that you're going to be responsible for monitoring and enforcing for 30 years, that's a considerable resource that's not accounted for in the NPPF.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Ellis, am I right in interpreting your earlier remarks in that basically we should be starting with the National Strategic Spatial Plan and working up from there, so working one direction from the National Strategic Plan and from the other from locally based plans coming up to meet them?
That would be the ideal. It's how many of the successful European nations do it. Spatially, we're working effectively without the key data at the moment. And I would say you can have that structure of planning, but there's one thing missing, which is that this country hasn't got a sustainable development strategy and hasn't had one since 2005. So where's the vision behind that strategy?
Could you perhaps write to the committee, one, with the good examples where this is done well in other jurisdictions, and two, to set out the recommendations that you'd like to see us make in order to implement that.
Thank you. Very quick question from Chris Hinchliffe. I'm going to come to Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, we've heard quite a lot about the need to accelerate the planning process, but given that there are environmental limits on growth, as we come up against those, is it inevitable that planning applications are going to come into conflict with more and more environmental regulations, and therefore inevitable that applications will be slower?
Yes, there is that conflict. That conflict is not inevitable, but you would have to build to a exponentially better standard than the standard we built at the moment. But can I just say in support of this idea, people are not a source of delay. It's called democracy. And democracy is not delay unless I'm living in the wrong country. And 2023-24, % of major applications decided within 13 weeks or an agreed timescale, 90%. So I've spent too many years on planning reform, and I know there are frustrations by the private sector which are perfectly legitimate. But the idea that this is all planning's fault, or that the system doesn't consent enough property and land, or that there is a source of chronic delay in the system, people get 21 days on a planning application to comment. They get 2 periods of 6 weeks on a local plan. That's all. The issue actually is building trust and consensus and having a proper conversation about our future, and that's called democracy, and that takes time.
Mr. Stafford, could I ask you to also respond to that question from Chris Hinchliffe?
Well, I mean, just in response to Hugh's point, yes, 90% of major applications are determined within agreed 13 weeks or agreed timeframes. But when you take out the extensions of time, which the former Secretary of State sought to shine a light on around 12 months ago, that figure drops to, I think, 19%. HBF members are waiting typically a year to get planning permission, which is a fundamental drag anchor on growth ambitions, especially for smaller members. Planning is complex. It's beholden on a range and variety of actors, and as I think you heard in the first session around the siloed mentality around policy formulation, well, there's a siloed mentality around development management as well. And I would respectfully contend that needs rethinking in the consenting regime.
Thank you, Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. If I could pitch this question first to Councillor Wright, and then if Mr Ellis and Mr Stafford would like to add their thoughts. The proposed changes to the Greenbelt might lead to an increased planning burden for local authorities. What resources would those authorities need to effectively implement the Grey Belt and changes to the Greenbelt?
Well, to start with, I think we need people that can actually understand what the changes are, especially with the definitions that are being applied at the moment to grey and green. So straight away there's an issue of actually trying to get to grips with that, to work out what it is and to avoid some of the pitfalls that are possible, as I think you heard in the first session, with regards to what the definition is and how that could possibly be abused, especially with regards to grey belt and the degradation. So there's going to be that monitoring. So for the local areas that have got green belt, and you know, an awful lot of this country, unfortunately, our residents don't understand the difference between green belt and green field. There's actually, you know, where there's proper green belt, then there's going to have to be even more thorough investigation of that taken to start with, to make sure that it's documented correctly. Then after that, it would just depend on the applications that come through. But as we know, most planning authorities at the moment say that they're understaffed and finding difficulty in actually acquiring trained planners. And I'm afraid a government announcement to say we're going to create so many doesn't actually cover a time span. So the time that it takes for a planner to become trained, to go through their degree and their masters, get the experience and understand an area and the constraints and opportunities within that area, that takes a long time. So this is not going to be a quick fix.
Thank you. Mr Ellis.
I would only add, I think, on grey belt that the only group of people who seem overwhelmingly supportive are KCs and the legal profession, because in my experience of planning reform, if you don't get your definitions right, you end up with a great deal of legal argument. I would also just say on the wider issue about Greenbelt, I'd recommend to the committee that they look in detail at Greenbelt designations, because it isn't a monolith, and particularly in the north, Greenbelt was designated around many industrial communities that we're about to touch. And it's a very fragmented set of designations. I mean, you can spit across the green belt between Leeds and Bradford, as you can between Nottinghamshire, between Nottingham and Derby, and between Chesterfield, Dronfield and Chesterfield. We're getting close. So it's very hard to see how you can do green belt or big releases without compromising the essential quality of green belt. That said, what really puzzles me about it all is you can release green belt now through a local plan process, and it happens all the time. I don't understand why we needed to change it, because that process seems to work reasonably well. If there's a bigger question about whether we have a green belt in this country, I think that should be a national conversation, to be honest.
Thank you. Mr Stafford?
I would take issue with Hugh's claim that that process for allocating land is working perfectly well, because the average time it takes to adopt a local plan is 7 years. So if that's the average, I would contend that in non-Greenbelt areas that might be 3 or 4 years, and in Greenbelt areas that's closer to 9 or 10 years. So what I think Greybelt is at root is recognition that the country's housing need, as I think was stated in a press release when it was announced, cannot be met on land entirely within the urban area, and is a way of reframing in the public consciousness what Greenbelt is and the need to build on it, and that sites that do make a limited contribution to the Greenbelt can come forward ahead of those time-consuming local plan processes. In specific answer to the question about local authority resources, I think that once the language is tightened in the definition between what's in the MPPF as consulted upon and what's in the PPG as consulted upon, once those two things speak to each other a little better, perhaps in a published version, I think the process of identifying grey belt will be relatively objective insofar as when the circumstances for its release can be justified. The subjectivity comes in defining what in what limited contribution makes insofar as the 5 tests is concerned. So I think some kind of further guidance or template from government on the process of undertaking a Greenbelt assessment and the judgments that get towards a significant, moderate or limited contribution pursuant to the 5 tests would make a meaningful difference to the transaction of the planning applications that it may precipitate, and that's a point made in the HBF's consultation response.
Thank you. So the NPPF has proposed reforms to planning application fees in equivalent to an uplift of around about 40%. How should the money accrued to local authorities from higher planning application fees be used? For example, would it be ring-fenced for environmental improvement and climate change adaptation measures, or reinvested into support for local authority planning departments? If I can pitch that in the same order, please.
Yeah, well, for a long time we've been actually seeking to see an uplift in planning fees to actually reflect the true cost of planning applications and the appeal process and everything that follows on from it. So it's not always just a simple application. There doesn't seem to be really anything coming through from the NPPF that seems to link that uplift to actually environmental protection. So I would say it would be down to each local authority to make sure that it's ring-fencing the money with regards to the planning process and all it entails, but how you would then decide if a percentage of that could be used for other matters other than the actual cost of applications, then I would like to see the evidence of how much is expected to be made, i.e. profit-wise, after you've actually paid for the planning process to be spent on anything else. And there isn't a lot there at the moment to suggest that there would actually be an excess of money in the system. We need to be employing more planners. We need to be making sure that the planning process is as speedy as it can be while still being accurate.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis.
I think by the time you've paid for the kind of digital transformation that we're planning for and the kind of restoration of the service, it doesn't seem to me there's going to be much headroom for anything else. But I do think I would add one thing about a younger generation of planners, that if you want to recruit new planners into the system, you have to this nation has to make up its mind whether it wants to do democratic planning or not. Because there is so much anti-planning agenda. I meet a lot of young people who just say, why on earth would I want to go into that? And if you're advocating planning as a highly skilled, professional, visionary, and a profession that can talk and reflect community aspirations, it's a high skill enterprise, and it will take time to put that resource and that ambition back.
Thank you. Mr. Stafford.
Yeah, I think as and until not just the development management but the entire planning service is put on a self-sustaining financial footing, then talk of ring fencing is something of a red herring, because even when fees go up, authorities may still be able to reduce the money going into the planning service from the central, from central funds, if you see what I mean. I think the consultation on the increase in planning application fees 18 or so months ago said that even with that increase, there'd be a £260 million gap between application fees and the cost of development management, notwithstanding the costs of the plan making, enforcement, and other planning services. So there's clearly a need to think about this again, but not in a way that simply puts application fees up on an arbitrary basis and for it to disappear into social care without any meaningful uplift on qualitative or quantitative outputs. There's talk in the NPPF consultation of locally set fees, which HBF is a little wary of. But what I am convinced of is the need to think about that development management service in the round, because the planning application itself is only 1/4 of a process that needs to take in meaningful pre-application advice, the application itself, legal agreements, Section 106 agreements, and then the discharge of conditions. And all four of those elements are fundamental to the issuing of a planning permission. And the statutory consultees that I mentioned before need bringing into that process as well for qualitative and quantitative service improvement. So I think the conversation about fees and authority resources needs to continue, but I think it would be better reimagining it from first principles rather than just adding extra percentages on every few years, as I say, for it to disappear into other council priorities.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cameron. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask some questions about the importance of delivering infrastructure to build sustainable communities. How confident are you that the infrastructure that's required to support 1.5 million houses will be delivered? Maybe I can start with Mr. Stafford.
Okay, I think we probably need to split that infrastructure into. Hugh talked about flood risk flood risk resilience previously. We need to probably talk about energy generation, energy transmission as well. We probably need to be thinking about the big pieces of kit and national policy statements, which the government, I think, has committed to review within 12 months. So I'll probably split that infrastructure in its broader sense into issues of national significance, and then maybe the infrastructure that you might associate with an individual planning application, which is more of the bread and butter and day-to-day headaches that HBF members come across. And I would be really interested in Richard's thoughts on this, because the delivery of the infrastructure that both existing and new residents would want to see as part of any major development is fiendishly difficult to deliver. Be that dealing with county highways or Highways England on road upgrades, junction improvements, that kind of thing, whether it's dealing with network rail around new stations, whether it's dealing with school places, GP surgeries. The system is very, very fragmented to everybody's discredit, because it looks to the general population as though these things are not being planned for in a coherent manner, and to the unsophisticated eye, I think that's probably a fair assessment.
Sounds like you're not terribly confident, but perhaps Councillor Wright, you might have some observations.
If I could just briefly come back to the previous question. I thought it's disingenuous to suggest that monies achieved for planning applications was going to general funds, because, as Mr Ellis pointed out, it's the most democratic situation we ever sort out. I'd like to invite you all to North Kesteven to see how we do get young planners. We actually grow our own, so we're obviously doing something to attract younger people. Am I confident the infrastructure will be delivered? Then the answer is no. It's as simple as that. There isn't anything really that's come forward in the revision of the MPPF to actually facilitate that. And we're talking from the already built environment again. We've already got a lack of infrastructure with regards to flood resilience and our utilities. Now, if we're looking to actually put a plan in place or suggest new housing coming forward, there's a disconnect between the local plan process and our utilities, for instance. So before we even talk about GP surgeries, schools and highways, the fact that we can have presentations from water companies that tell us what their business plan is, and we tell them that we've got a new local plan just about to come into force, and they still don't align because there is no duty to cooperate, which is what's desperately needed. So we can't even. So developers, in the main, have the right to connect. Sometimes there are mitigating situations put in place where the infrastructure might be requested on top of that, but you end up with an infrastructure system that's already overburdened, and then we're seeing the news that we've actually got water companies admitting to sewage discharges on systems that new houses are being allowed to connect to because there is no requirement to put that infrastructure in place to start with. That's before we even get onto road infrastructure, GP infrastructure, all the sort of softer. So I'm talking about the really basic infrastructure. There is nothing that I've seen in the revision that will actually change that situation.
Ellis?
I wish I was more confident. I think that the way that we organise infrastructure provision and housing in this country is, on a European scale, fairly catastrophically poor. And the interesting thing is that there is a lack of a master developer role. And that's why the debate, the government's interest in development corporations and new towns is interesting, because without that master developer role on a scheme level, it's very difficult to generate the kind of coordination that you need. It is possible, but it will take a great deal of time as a nation to get back to having a national spatial plan, which basically sets out what goes where. And it's interesting to hear the talk about where most of this growth will take place. The idea that it will follow the current economic trend into the southeast is interesting, because that reinforces a paradox that won't go away environmentally, which is that the southeast has environmental limits which we're now banging our head on. So in that sense, I think that I'm not confident. But there's one other much bigger issue. And here I think, and it's much more difficult, and it's this. The expectation is that the private sector will be the biggest generator through development values of infrastructure at a scheme level through Section 106. And there are limited headroom values, even with land value capture, which I am a great supporter of. It is not a magic money tree. And the lessons of the new towns and the lessons of other major infrastructure successes in this country suggest that national government has to back investment. So an investment programme in social rent or an investment to modernise our national grid. If the expectation is that that will solely be driven by the private sector in this framework, I think that's extremely unlikely. What I'm really worried about is that a development is allowed to proceed before the necessary infrastructure is delivered, because infrastructure first is probably the most golden rule of good town and country planning there can be. And in that sense, I think, again, this is going to take time. But we do need master developers to build out at scale. And that is where development corporations could be transformational.
So given that there is so little confidence that the infrastructure is going to either be delivered upfront or that it indeed will follow, what do you all think are the biggest sort of environmental risks that we should be sort of alive to? So maybe I can start with Mr. Stafford again.
Like I said before, the MPPF is as I think Ant Breach said, is in around reversing the December 23 changes, and the Environment Act, the Habitats Regs, everything else is as is. So I'm not sure I would detect a net change, if you like, in the three legs of Alister Scott's stool that he talked about before. I think it's the so in reversing those changes, I think that's a positive thing, certainly from a HBF point of view. What I would hope that the new government can turn its attention to, having done so, is the functionality and the cross-departmental working and the sense of purpose, horizontal working, or whatever the Whitehall wonks would call it, to try to knit some of these disparate strands together in the spirit of that win-win letter that the two Secretaries of State sent to environmental NGOs in July.
Thank you, Mr. Stafford. Mr. Ellis?
As a one sentence answer, climate mitigation. We're going to lose places on the East Coast. All the professionals know that. We all know it from a flood risk point of view. The MPPF is staggeringly been blindsided by the climate crisis on adaptation. The money that we're going to need to defend ourselves has to be found, and that means a reassessment of investing in resilience is the best pound of infrastructure spend you will ever make for this country.
Yeah. And finally, Councillor Wright.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that as well. It was mentioned earlier about split responsibilities between MHCLG and DEFRA. I'd like to add the EA to that. Because that's where we've got huge issues, so we can have an area that's planned out, but we know now that flood mitigation is just not taking place. Yeah. There's a huge amount of investment, we're being told all the time is needed, but it doesn't seem to be starting. For instance, in parts of Lincolnshire, there were breaches from Babette and Hank, and going into this winter, they've not been repaired. So we've already got existing issues before we even start to add to the built form. So the biggest threat, of a single threat, I think, environmentally, is flooding, but there are so many others.
In the interest of time, Chair, did you want to move on to other members?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we can certainly sympathise with that in Chesterfield. Anna Gelderd.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll be asking questions around the economic emphasis of the MPPF and how this compares to environmental concerns. So if I can begin with, in your view, to what extent do the reforms effectively support economic growth while simultaneously protecting and improving the environment? And Mr. Ellis, maybe I come to you first.
This is difficult. As an organisation, to give a practical example in the MPPF, if I've missed a meeting, we're now back on a focus on GDP growth through housing as a macroeconomic instrument in this country. Let's just leave aside whether or not massively expanding consents will result in a massive expansion in delivery, and I'm deeply sceptical about that. The challenge also is a balancing measure about social value and the creation of different forms of economic value, and you heard about that from previous witness. As a very practical measure, what I'm really disturbed about is that communities actually create enormous amounts of social value when they're enabled to do so. Can I give you an example on flood defence? My town of Matlock can't afford its flood defence, it isn't getting any. You can, and as lots of communities have done, undertake slow the flow rewilding exercises on the floodplain, and you know, no local authority currently is actually allocating land in their local plans to do that. If you really want to give people an opportunity to have agency, which is critical for their mental health in a town like ours where we've had 2 deaths from flooding in 3 years, there has to be part of the MPPF which is about that social value, that people question. I don't see that necessarily as incompatible with a drive for GDP growth, but I think it's fairly strange that it's invisible in the MPPF. It was such an amazing opportunity for place. It really is. What is the urban policy? And what is that vision? And the interesting thing is it doesn't cost anything. And it doesn't necessarily upset the development community because what we're doing is building resilience. What's not to like? So I think that the disappointment is that there isn't the diversity of economic approach.
Yeah, and Councillor Wright.
I don't think there has to be a conflict. It can be planned. You know, if you plan correctly for where your economic growth is, and that's that balance. I mean, when we talk about providing land for housing, we've got to think about why we're building the houses in the first place and what kind of place do we want to create. So there's a balance there to be taken with regards to that. But it's about then making sure that across the piece that we actually invest correctly. As Hugh mentioned, the social value, we don't want to be building places just for people that can afford to move into them and can afford certain levels of jobs, or even just people that are moving into an area to commute, and therefore taking house prices out of the range of people that have lived there for many years. And of course, in our area, we've tried to balance that. We managed to get our local plan review through before the ministerial statement of December 23, which we would like to see reversed. And so we were able to actually plan for economic structures, green infrastructure, and also higher standards of thermal insulation in our housing developments going forward. So you can plan around some of it, but it's, as you say, it's such a fine balance that we've got to look at what is the economic effect on the environment, what is it we're trying to protect and how we're trying to protect it whilst keeping that balance. So it's a difficult one. We can do it to a certain degree, but I can't really see that there's much coming through from the MPPF that really gives us any more tools.
Thank you. And Mr. Stafford, I'll come to you.
I'm not honestly sure I've got very much more to add, just anecdotally and personally. Clive Betts, the former chair of the HCLG committee, once told me that in the Netherlands planning is seen as part of the solution and in the UK planning is seen as part of the problem. I think that's something to work towards reversing.
Well, thank you. Maybe I'll come to you, Mr. Ellis, in the first instance in my next question, which is around examples. So it'd be really interesting to hear some good examples of successful housing projects that have achieved both economic growth and improved ecosystems and biodiversity.
Yes.
Mr. Stafford, Mr. Ellis has indicated he would like to speak first, which is very welcome to do.
Sorry, I was going to be enthusiastic for a minute.
Glad to hear it.
I mean, look, we can do this, and it was just a joy to be in Essex last week with authorities who are building at Passive House standard or equivalent and upholding policies in their local plans to do that, and be with the medium-sized entrepreneurs and developers who are capable of taking that on, and the small ones who want to do it. What an opportunity for economic renewal. What an opportunity for creating new markets. What an opportunity for a genuinely green economy. But you only do that with a regulatory framework which pushes hard, and both in terms of energy performance, on resilience, and also, just to be clear, we were so good at this as a nation. We transformed housing after the First War and built the classic council, 3-bedroom council house with a front and back garden capable of supporting 6 months of food production. And to be honest with you, the domestic architecture in this country has not gone in the right direction after that. So and that's not an issue about any particular detailed design. I'm just talking, I suppose, about why this is always cast in a problematic way, when actually many other nations, particularly Northwest European nations, are capable of getting this regulatory framework right, where they say that's the direction of travel, we will be at genuinely zero carbon homes. We could have done it in 2016. You asked the question how much carbon has been emitted from abandoning 2016 targets. So for me, this is a pro-growth agenda. It's just a different kind of growth.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Ellis, did you have an example you wanted to share with us? Oh, sorry, Mr. Stafford.
I wouldn't want to highlight any particular HBF members' scheme for putting other HBF members' noses out of joint, other than to perhaps point out that one member did once tell me that nobody gets up in the morning with a desire to make a bad place, and there are multiple examples. I mean, I know it's the poor ones that do the round on social media every now and then, but they are very much in the minority. I think where the overlaps of where successful schemes are created are where there is a clear and consistent policy environment and key stakeholders working in partnership. They are the golden rules as far as I'm concerned.
Very interesting. And Councillor Wright, any successful projects that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I can write it out afterwards to put the the skin on the bones. But I mean, I've got examples of Mansfield District Council sustainable urban drainage solutions, where they've looked at the problems with flood mitigation. You've got Crawley Borough Council with the town centre heat network, which again is about reducing carbon. South Cambridgeshire, you've got the Waterbeach New Town, which is about sustainable new homes and a minimum of 25% biodiversity net gain, which is phenomenal. Cheltenham Borough Council, you've got the Golden Valley development, which is high-tech, high-skilled jobs while still maintaining good environmental standards. But can I just throw a bad one in as well? And that's obviously the ministerial statement that's severely affected West Oxfordshire District Council and stopped them from actually putting their plan together, which was roughly around the same as the Central Lincolnshire plan, because another good example is our own plan, where we actually set the thermal efficiency of new homes. So therefore, not just worrying about whether you put solar panels on or not, if you actually get the insulation levels beyond government recommended levels now, take them to the highest level you can. And of course, we would say that we can't expect every developer to build a passive house, but the evidence from the Passive House Institute says if you build at scale, it only increases the cost by 4%. So can we afford to do it? And it's there. So we build our own council homes to passive house standard, but within the local plan area, they must build to a higher thermal efficiency than anywhere else.
Thank you. And finally, on nature recovery commitments, briefly, how might the proposed changes to the planning system impact the UK's ability to meet these national and international nature recovery commitments? Mr. Ellis, you may have.
I think we've heard a number of times, and I think it's accurate, that there haven't been any changes to the NPPF to deal with those wider issues about nature recovery. But this country has an incredibly degraded biodiversity and environment. It doesn't have to be like that. Development and biodiversity are compatible when done brilliantly well. What worries me is that there's nothing in the NPPF to address the fact. I mean, let's be very clear about it as a planner. The current NPPF framework is not fit for purpose on nature and the environment. So the fact that it hasn't changed, that gives me no comfort at all. And I think the kind of measures you'd need to do that is to go back to the very beginning of it and give it a proper definition of sustainable development, because it doesn't have that as a document.
Briefly, do either of the others have a comment on that? Councillor Wright, perhaps you first.
Just with regards to nature recovery, I mean, and for instance, BNG, I'm very concerned that we set a system up that actually it decides where you can actually have nature recovery. So the idea was to improve the area where you were, where the development was, and instead off-site credits is going to create that somewhere else, creates a problem for local authorities, as I said earlier, with regards to monitoring and implementation. But also, is that dictating where we actually improve nature, or are the developers going to be allowed to do that through the crediting because they can't produce it on site? And is that the real purpose of BNG? And can we actually call that nature recovery?
Finally, Mr. Stafford, anything to add?
I'm not necessarily sure I'd share the same concerns about off-site BNG as has been expressed this afternoon. Provided that off-site contribution is being leveraged with others to maximum impact and benefit. And in that regard, I think it will come to be seen as somewhat regretful that BNG was introduced before the local nature recovery strategies. I think I'm right in saying that the West of England has recently published the first finally local nature recovery strategy, because they could have had a more coordinating role in the off-site BNG credit market, as well as providing a platform to deal with nutrient neutrality, which is emblematic of dysfunction in that environmental regulatory regime, and we haven't talked about this afternoon. So I think, yes, I think I think of the expediting of local nature recovery strategies and their relationship to whatever universal strategic planning coverage looks like could be of significant benefit in this space if we're talking about this in towards the end of the Parliament.
Thank you, Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've heard quite a lot about land supply in the sessions this afternoon. Housing, of course, is only one of the demands that we have on our land at the moment, alongside food security, energy security, transport, nature restoration targets for woodland cover, and as has just been alluded to, we already have exceptionally fragmented and degraded ecosystems in our country, and we have on average 14,000 hectares of land taken from undeveloped land into developed land every year. So taking that whole context into account, do you feel that the government's current policies relating to land use are coherent? Mr. Ellis, I'll start with you.
Well, they can't be because they're not expressed in a coherent land use strategy, and we've already heard we're waiting for that. I mean, that's quite a depressing list, but I think the thing that strikes me most is that from the 1970s in this country, there was quite an interesting debate. There were land white papers which expressed the need to fundamentally deal with a declining resource and how you democratically decide how to use it. But unless I think the first step to that is understanding and data, all of which exists but isn't mapped collectively at the moment. And that will be an amazing resource. But England has always been as a nation, always very resistant to any kind of national planning. And here's the reason why. If you map all those constraints together, it has enormous political consequences that nobody wants to see. And particularly if you map the kind of land we're going to lose. So there's about to be in the next 10 to 15 years an enormous realignment in the land market based on investment in flood risk areas. And the fact that the nation has no strategy is like flying a jumbo jet towards a mountain in the fog and smashing up your radar. And that's what happened when we smashed up regional planning, interestingly. And so if we can't agree a reasonable approach to the basic data, once you've got the data in the strategy, then I have to decide what to do with it. And that's a fundamental question about whether you continue to develop from Bournemouth to Cambridge in the golden arc that Treasury has on its wall, or whether or not you think about the rest of the country.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wright?
I agree with what Hugh says. I mean, land use strategy, there simply isn't one. And I mean, an area I'd like to sort of explore on that is with regards to NSIP. So, Lincolnshire provides 30% of the country's vegetables. It's soon going to be covered in solar panels. Now, yes, we have to transition away from fossil fuel, but at the moment there's nothing about a cumulative effect. So we're simply seeing numerous applications coming in, more and more each month, and we're talking about thousands of hectares of land being covered because there's no cumulative strategy to this at all. It's not been looked at. It's not been considered at the moment. So there isn't a strategy. It's just land is being used, and that's got to change.
Very much, Mr. Stafford.
I just emphasise what I said before that the local plans presently are the only spatial expression of land use priorities, and they're having to deal with matters of regional and national significance, as you've just heard. So I think the system operationally and from a more intellectual academic point of view, as far as what it is that we're trying to achieve, can only benefit from giving spatial expression to these various competing national priorities, and being a platform for people to talk about them and understand them and be aware of the trade-offs.
Thank you. I think that was a fairly clear, if anxiety-inducing, set of responses. To follow up on that then, as Barry has alluded to, we will be setting out a report with recommendations. Are the key recommendations relating to getting a coherent land use strategy in place that you would like to see the committee reflecting in its report? I'll go round in the same order again. So, Mr. Ellis.
Absolutely, that strategy is vital, but it has to be developed as a conversation with people, not just as a technical exercise. And there are two things. We can argue about structures. We're really good in planning, arguing about procedure. But we're not very good at establishing what the purpose should be. The recommendations, I think, of this process, such an important inquiry, should be what is the purpose of the land use planning system? Because I can't tell you sitting here as a qualified planner what it is. I can tell you what I'd like to see the recommendation. which is you go back to the heart of the NPPF, reconstitute a meaningful definition of sustainable development, which is deliberately disempowered in the NPPF by saying that the sustainable development goals only apply at a very high level. Now that's a mechanism introduced by the civil service to make sure you could never challenge any decision against the 17 goals. And if you put that back and have a sustainable development strategy based on 2005, 90% of which actually is still pretty good as a strategy, then you begin to have a clear objective and a common objective of which you can have a conversation with people about. But without that, you have structure without outcome, and that is not what is going to work.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Councillor Wright?
Totally agree. It's got to be, to use an expression, it's got to be from the ground up. It's got to be through consultation, through people that actually understand the situation rather than pre-written and then another consultation on a few minor points to say consultation has been carried out, which unfortunately is my jaded view on most consultation. So it needs to be there, and it needs to be written in a way as well that if we're talking about democracy, in a way that your average person can understand, and I don't mean a dumbing down of language, I mean a strategy that people across the country can buy into, because then that makes the whole situation much simpler, and we don't end up with just protest groups that don't understand the fundamentals of what's actually trying to be achieved.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. Mr. Stafford?
I think a spatial plan for England is a laudable and meaningful objective that everybody should be advocating for. I'd also put a Royal Commission on the future of the Greenbelt to make that fit for the 21st century, something that everybody needs to coalesce around to make everybody's lives better. I think that national development management policies can have a role. I think that the example that Richard was talking about as far as that legal challenge in Oxfordshire around the ability of local authorities to go at a faster pace than building regs in the net zero space is emblematic of the fact that the government is not going, if not going fast enough, is not being clear enough as to its intentions as to the regulatory framework, and I would advocate just getting that into building regs, so that's one less thing that planning has to deal with. And then also on my wish list would be that this horizontal coordination across government point. So you've got, Richard mentioned the Environment Agency. A few years ago, you had Natural England unilaterally putting holding notices across 74 local authorities because of the nutrient neutrality issue. And yet I read this week that the Environment Agency has not declined a permit for an industrial poultry unit in the Severn and the Wye. So you've got, which is a level of dysfunction that I think serves as a massive discredit on everybody involved. They would be on my wish list.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah Gibson.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we are running over time, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about something which we have touched upon, which is the community engagement side of it. And Councillor Wright, you mentioned the issues around legislation being inflicted upon communities and local governments, and as having been a member of a local government for a long time, I share your concerns. So do you think that these changes to the NPPF are going to encourage or discourage local communities from participating? I mean, will these local communities have access to the necessary information and support to play any meaningful part in the planning decisions? And if not, and how do you think this can be addressed? And at what stage do you think that these communities should be involved? I'll start with Councillor Wright, since I've referenced him, and then move on to...
From a point of consultation, and it should be as early as possible so that you can engage people fully rather than them thinking it's a done deal. With regards to most of our residents, the planning is one of the most inflammatory things that they ever see us doing. They don't really concern themselves with the rest of what local government actually does. It's planning that normally gets them agitated. And we've got a trust issue now. So if, for instance, you're in an area that's got a made local plan and you've gone through the numbers, you've gone through the call for land, and all of a sudden we've got to try and explain to them why we've got these extra houses we've now got to build, they don't see a minister's signature on that. They don't see, with respect to any MP signature on that. It's the local planning authority that's suddenly going to inflict these houses on them. So we've got to make sure that we communicate that. So that is very much down to the local authority to get that communication effectively out there as early as possible and as widely as possible. And in the main, I think most of us do that. It's just that quite often with being reactionary to new policy or new changes or new regulation, is that it's that trust. It seems to be that breaking of trust. We've told them one thing 1 month and we're now telling them another thing. And so quite often it perpetuates this situation of everybody saying that local authority planning is broken. But it's just because things happen that people don't like, and that's the reality of it. So the answer is communicate as early as possible, as effectively as possible, and across the different mediums as well. We find that most effective. And don't ignore anything. We need to make sure that we engage people across the generations, because quite often the people we need to communicate with are the younger people, because we're creating situations for them to actually deal with in the next 40, 50 years.
I'll come to Hugh Ellis first, and then Mr. Stafford.
I mean, there's a sort of legal answer about the Aarhus Convention and the fact that we have legal responsibilities to get this right. But I think just building on what's been said rather than repeating it, I think culturally what I encounter as a professional planner is people are a problem. There's a deep-seated, rooted idea that people are a problem, and it runs right through all parts, actually, of the body politic of this country. And I'm not convinced there's sufficient understanding in Whitehall that people sometimes are our reality with their own aspirations, needs and places, or that the diversity of experience in places in England is really different and requires, and the NPPF makes no reflection of that whatsoever, a single one-size-fits-all idea. But ultimately, the proposition we have as an organisation looking for pro-housing, socially just future is that, ask the question, is this a democracy or not? And if it's a democracy, people have to be fully involved in the way that's been just described. Technically, that's fairly straightforward to do. Private and public sector can be good at it if they've got resources. But if you don't get it right, and this is my problem, if you introduce the new housing target into the current regime, then you will have a period of planning by appeal, which all of us as professionals understand will last between 2 and 4 years. Planning by appeal is the worst form for building consensus and trust. And if there is a mission missing, it's a democracy mission. And if you want to find out how to play it out more powerfully than any other, it's planning, where that democracy issue bangs against local people's aspirations. The previous Labour government had a policy, so to be clear about a recommendation, called People's Involvement in Planning the Government's Objectives. Fine document it was too. Bring it back, please. Make it clear that people's voice, even when I don't agree with it and it annoys the hell out of me, is still a democratic right.
Yes, so I've just come to Mr. Stafford, but I think that the argument is earlier engagement and more meaningful engagement. Mr. Stafford, do you have anything else to...
I think this is just such a fascinating topic, and could talk about it all day. I mean, what question are we asking? I mean, there's been a couple of live examples of this over the past few weeks and months. So you've got the Norwich to Thetford pylon brouhaha through Norwich and Suffolk and Essex. And what's the question that we're asking the general population there? What level of democratic involvement are we talking about? As the government's been elected to decarbonise the grid, which means finding a way of getting power not from the Trent Valley around the country, but from the North Sea around the country, and that requires a connection from the North Sea into the southeast. So, what question are we asking the general public? Are we asking the good people of Norfolk as to whether or not there should be a grid connection along that route, or are we asking them what colour they'd like the pylons to be? The Secretary of State was asked. The Minister was asked this morning about intervening in a planning application in Swale for large-scale residential development on the basis that it's in the national interest. Again, I go back to that point about Swale then determining a planning application that is in the national interest without any spatial expression of it. So we could talk about all this all afternoon, but without a cascaded proportionality in planning with some spatial expression of national, regional, local and neighbourhood priorities, I think it's very difficult to talk to people about. Richard made the point about agricultural land versus solar generation. I mean, these are national conversations you're expecting local councillors to have, and I just think until the system has that degree of proportionality to it, it's just embedding further conflict and antagonism.
I think we've answered the second part of that question in the first part, to be honest. So I think that concludes. I quite clearly need better engagement and earlier engagement.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our panel. We've come to the conclusion of the first session of this really important inquiry. A huge amount for us to think about. Thank you very much to our three panellists for your excellent contributions. And we'll bring this to a close. Order, order.